Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, we're back with episode 4. I can't believe we're already 4 episodes in. So I redid episode 3 last week because it wasn't how I wanted it to be. And now it sounds really good, but the volume is really low. So, it's a learning curve recording. I used to do it with Diva on our other podcast, and it took us forever to get the sound good. And even then we would have hiccups. So I'm kind of feel like I'm starting over again on my own, but hopefully overall it's a better experience. It sounds better. I'm just really hoping that I can figure out how to make it loud without having it pick up every single time I sniffle or make a weird noise, which right now I have not mastered that. So hope you guys can just hang in with me. But anyway, hi, welcome back. This is episode 4 of True Crime California. I'm Cindy, your host, and I'm going to talk about another case from the 80s. And I know you guys have probably had your fill of 80s cases, but there's just a lot of good ones. But at least this is a little later on in the 80s. This case takes place in 1986, and this is the really tragic murder of Cara Knott. As I said, this story takes place in 1986 in the San Diego area. This story might be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones that I have done and will do. But it's a pretty wild story, so I still want to cover it. It's definitely been covered by Forensic Files and, a bunch of other sort of true crime TV shows. So it's definitely an intriguing and interesting story. It just doesn't have quite as much information at this point as some of the other stories. I don't think it was quite as big in the news. And then also, obviously, the age of the case makes it harder to find information. Anyway, let's just get into it. So Cara Knott was born February 11th, 1966 in Ventura, California, which is about 70 miles or so north of Los Angeles. She was the third of 4 siblings, and she and her family moved to El Cajon, which is sort of it's a city, but almost kind of considered a suburb in San Diego County, almost like a suburb of San Diego. They moved there when she was pretty young. Her father, Sam, was a stockbroker. Her mother worked at a hospital, in a nursing setting, I think, but also may have taken some time off of work to care for the kids. The family was very, very close. They were a really tight family. And from photos of Sam and Cara, you can tell that she was very special to him, and they were especially close. Cara graduated from El Cajon High in 1984. And decided to get her teaching credential at San Diego State, which is great because she could stay living with her parents and just make the drive. Cara was a really pretty young woman. She had the Farrah Fawcett blonde hair. You could tell that she dressed in a trendy way. She was super cute. She had a boyfriend, Wayne, who lived in nearby Escondido. And Wayne was also really handsome. He looks oh my God, what's his name? Eric Estrada from Chips. Now that ages me because that show was even too old for me. But when I saw the picture of him, I was wow, he looks straight up like an 80s heartthrob. They were a beautiful couple. Now, for those who don't know, San Diego County has a lot of sort of like I was saying, not really suburbs, but separate cities that all sort of butt up to each other. And they all kind of use San Diego as the catch-all when explaining where people are from. So for Los Angeles, if you live in Torrance or Van Nuys, you'll probably just tell people you live in LA. So it's kind of the greater Los Angeles area. This is the greater San Diego area. And because a lot of people went to, the same big college, San Diego State University, people from these smaller towns would end up knowing each other and dating each other. And that's sort of the case here, where Wayne lived about 33 miles from Cara, but because they both went to San Diego State University, they started dating, and the distance between them wasn't considered to be that big of a deal or that out of the ordinary, for them to still date and live in different cities, sort of in the same general area. So anyway, before heading off to college, Cara was a star student at El Cajon High, really well liked, popular, and again, very close with her family. She was a track star who loved animals and even worked at the zoo for a time. She was really, really into conservation of natural habitats for wild animals and was therefore also a bit of an environmentalist. So just a really wholesome, sweet, and also very driven person who wanted to make a difference in the world and always was trying to do her best to make things better, which is probably why she was going to school or to college to get her teaching credential so she could be a teacher and, change the lives of young people, which is great. Now, as I mentioned, she was really close with her dad, and Sam always instilled in his children not so much a fear of the world, but a clear understanding of it as well as its potential dangers. He taught Cara and her siblings to be careful, not accept rides from strangers, keep their wits about them when they're out alone, just all the smart things. And he also taught Cara, or he also had Cara take self-defense classes so she would know how to defend herself should she ever be attacked. So really just trying to make sure that his children know how to take care of themselves, make good choices, and just generally stay safe. Now, Cara and her boyfriend Wayne were really close. They spent a lot of time together, and they'd been together for a while. So when Wayne got sick over Christmas in 1986, Cara went to take care of him for a few days. She wanted to get back home as soon as she could, and she had told her sister she wanted to spend time with the family over the holidays as well. But she just kind of felt obligated to care for Wayne because he was actually sick on Christmas with the flu, which is just depressing and sad. So it was really sweet that she went over and took care of him. All of the kids in Cara's family, including her youngest brother, were now out of the house, either away at college or living and working away from their parents' home, and Cara was worried that this year would be the last they had together as a family at Christmas. Apparently, the family were well known for being really over the top during the holidays, but in a really good way, with decorations and parties and tons of family time together. Cara in particular loved this. And she was really sad that it was coming to an end, so she didn't want to miss it because she thought, this is the last year this is going to happen. But she also loved Wayne, and she wanted to be there to take care of him. So either on Christmas Day or the day after, she left her parents' home in El Cajon, and I think she was still living there, and went to see Wayne in Escondido. While with Wayne, Cara called her mother Joyce a few times for advice on how to take care of him, including how to use a thermometer, which is really cute and also shows that despite being officially an adult, Cara was still young and innocent and learning how to be in the world as an adult person, which I thought was endearing and just says a lot about her. Even though she wasn't sure what she was doing, she was determined to be a caretaker and be there for her boyfriend. So anyway, on December 27th, Wayne said he was feeling better, so Cara decided to go back home and spend the rest of the holiday with her family. She called her parents around 8 p.m. from Wayne's house to tell them she was on her way. Now, this is something she did regularly, as again, her father had taught her to always let someone know where she's going, where she is, so if anything happened, people would know right away, which is very, very smart, and especially back in the 80s when there weren't cell phones or tracking devices. So she called and said, "I'll be home in about 45 minutes, which is about exactly how long it should take. Her family was all together, like I said, so they kept kind of going on with the night. They watched Sleeping Beauty, they did a puzzle together, and her mother Joyce said they sort of lost track of time. It wasn't until around 10 p.m., 2 hours after Cara called, that her father Sam sat up in bed and told Joyce something was terribly wrong. They called the police, but the police were not, helpful. They basically said, we're not going to do jack shit for at least 48 hours. And that was the amount of time someone had to be missing before they'd even start looking for them. So Sam, who we will learn is a hell of a go-getter and never took no for an answer, got his family together along with Wayne, Cara's boyfriend, and started looking for her themselves. They searched through the night, taking the route Cara always took home, which was along the I-15 freeway. They searched off-ramps, gas stations, everywhere, and they didn't sleep or stop at all that night. Finally, around 6 a.m. or so, Cara's older sister Cindy and her husband Bill passed an off-ramp for the second time, and this time they decided to take a closer look. This off-ramp was probably ignored at first because it went to a quick dead end with no houses or facilities nearby. It basically just backed up to a construction site with a fence around it. So why would Cara pull off there? Why would her car be there? But even so, they decided to check it out because it was one of the few places they hadn't really looked. And there, they did, in fact, find Cara's car, which was a small white VW Bug. When they looked inside the car, they found it empty, so they began yelling and screaming Cara's name, hoping to find her nearby. When that didn't work, they immediately went and called the police, who took a full 40 minutes to arrive on the scene. Following literally behind them was Sam, who saw the police speeding down the highway. Now, he was still out looking for Cara, and when he saw this, Sam later said he, quote, just knew. So he followed behind. Just around the corner from where her car was found, there was an abandoned bridge about 75 feet above a ditch filled with brush. Police searched the area, and Sam said that after they'd been gone a few minutes, he saw them come back, go into the trunk of one of their patrol cars, and put on gloves before going back to the area under the bridge. When they came back sometime later, they approached Sam, and one officer began to cry while they told him they had found Cara and that she was dead. That officer, while interviewed later, said he would never forget Sam's response. "I wish you had known her. She was an angel." Which is really, really sad. Just terrible. So police began to secure the area and take evidence, including tire tracks near her body. They took molds of the tires and continued their investigation. Of course, as we could all imagine, Wayne was their number one suspect at that time. Not only was he the last one to see her, but it's always the boyfriend, right? It's always the boyfriend. It's always the husband. It's always the significant other. Also, police had concluded pretty quickly that Cara had willingly driven off the freeway down that off-ramp. There was nothing wrong with her car, no evidence of an accident or anything mechanically wrong. And so police knew that, especially with a father like Sam, Cara would have never pulled over for someone unless it was somebody that she trusted or someone she knew. They interviewed Wayne. They were really thinking it was him. But he had an alibi. He was home, still sick, and his sister was there with him and confirmed he'd been there all night. Police obviously were like, it's his sister. She could just be covering for him. So they still thought it could be Wayne, but they did keep looking for other suspects. They weren't super convinced. I think they got a good vibe from Wayne. They realized, he's probably telling the truth. So they kept looking for other suspects, kept doing their investigation. And meanwhile, the people of San Diego are completely terrified. Who was this murderer out there on the loose? How did he kill this woman who was simply driving home? So to help quell people's fears, a local news reporter asked the CHP in the area if they could do a segment about how to stay safe while driving alone, especially at night. The CHP tapped a 13-year veteran of the force to do this interview and sort of like a ride-along. This man's name was Craig Pyer. Now, Craig had a spotless record over his 13 years on the force, and he had also done TV interviews and other media requests for the department previously. Why am I tripping on my words? In addition, the area where Cara was killed was his beat, and in fact, he had been on duty that night. So it made sense that he would do this interview because he knew the area. So not only could he talk in general terms about safety, but he also had a specific knowledge that likely made the interview more interesting for the general public. Now, during the interview, which I noted ended up being a ride-along, Craig talked about how dangerous it was to get out of your car if you have car trouble. He said it's best to just lock your doors and wait for help or wait until it's light out. He said never get into the car with a stranger, and that if anybody pulls over to offer assistance, just ask them to call the CHP and leave it at that. Because, as soon as you're in the car with that person, you are at their mercy and they can do whatever they want to you. And he said that for women especially, this could lead to being raped or even killed. Also, you can find this segment on YouTube to this day. So you can go watch this interview where he's talking about safety. It's very 80s. It's very old school. They pull a motorist, or they pull up to a motorist who's on the side of the road. He ran out of gas and is putting gas in his car. So it's very news segmenty from the 80s, if that's something you guys are interested in. So yeah, it's on YouTube. You can find it really easily. Now, this segment aired only 2 days after Cara's body was found, and during this time, police had a number of calls in about the case via Crime Stoppers. After the segment aired, another 300 or so calls came in, and around 30 of those were from young women in the area. As it turned out, many of these women looked like Cara and were around her age. Most of them drove similar cars to Cara, with 2 of the women driving the exact color and year VW Bug that Cara had. All of these women called in for the same reason: to complain about CHP officer Craig Pyer. That's right, they all called in to complain about the officer in the video. They all had similar stories about how he had pulled them over on that same road, Mercy Road, under the abandoned bridge. Many said he, quote, detained them for up to 90 minutes and would sit in the front seat of their car and ask them wildly inappropriate, sexually charged questions. The women were all terrified during this ordeal, and many were too afraid to complain after the fact. That being said, a few did in fact call in about this officer, and the CHP completely ignored them, and I don't think I need to explain why. We all know. They don't give a shit. They don't care about the public. They don't care about women. They definitely weren't going to listen to a few women complaining about a man with a spotless record. But now we know exactly why it was spotless, which is absolutely ridiculous. And as it turns out, he had been doing this for years and years. There is a woman named Amy Sterling Casil, I don't know, Casil, who recounts on her website how she was pulled over by Craig Pyer in either 1981 or 1982. And I'll remind you, Cara was killed in 1986. Now, Amy said that he tried to make her get out of her car, which was a white VW Rabbit, which is very close to Cara's car, and that when she didn't immediately comply, he attempted to pull her car door open. When she said to him while he's jiggling her car door that her grandfather was a CHP officer who told her if a cop ever asked her to get out of her car, he was probably not actually a cop, Pyer quickly changed his tune and started lecturing her on safety while driving alone at night. He then let her go. So he'd been doing this for at least 4 years before Cara was murdered, which is insane to me because according to CHP, he didn't have a thing on his record. That being said, it's also not that surprising, as we know. So beyond these women calling in, there were quite a few people who called in to say they noticed Craig had visible scratches on his nose and forehead during the interview, and that they looked pretty fresh, maybe only a couple of days old. When asked about the scratches, Pyer said he fell into a fence at the police station, but when police looked into this, they noticed that the fence was about 8 feet high. So he would have had to jump up and fly into it face first for this to even be slightly possible, which is obviously just fucking silly. No way did that happen. So anyway, these calls created the first real lead for the police, though they later said that's not really why they looked into Craig Pyer. Whatever the reason, they started looking into him, and he cooperated fully with the investigation. He even turned over the uniform he'd been wearing the night of the murder so that it could be tested. And while looking over his uniform, investigators found a gold-edged shoulder patch on the uniform, and the threads from that patch matched those found on Cara's body. And apparently, they were a very specific type of thread that was super unique and microscopically consistent with the threads on the patch. So what was on her body matched the patch, and it wasn't just CVS brand thread. It was a very particular type of thread with a very particular way of being colored, and it was very, very rare. So they were like, this is almost for sure from his patch to her clothing. To be sure, they sent the fibers in for further testing, which only further confirmed that they were a match. As for Craig, he turned over his logbook because this was in the 80s when they didn't necessarily have tracking for police. And in it, police found that while he had a timestamp for where he was at all points during the night, including when the murder occurred, they also found that there was a clear eraser mark on one of the logs with the time changed to around 9:30, which is the time police expected Cara had been killed. So he was attempting to create an alibi for himself, but he didn't do a very good job because you could see the eraser marks. When searching his car, police found a rope inside, and this was very significant because Cara, it was found, hadn't actually died from being thrown over the bridge as originally thought, and it was thought that because it did create a lot of trauma to her body, including crushed bones. But what it was found is she had actually been strangled to death with a ligature. And when they investigated further, they found that the ligature marks on her neck matched the rope perfectly. So the size and the spacing of the rope matched the ligature marks on her neck. They also found a bruise on her forehead as if she'd been hit by something, which police later determined was likely a police flashlight. Now, going back to the uniform, they also found fibers from Cara's sweatpants on Craig Pyer's uniform. And when looking over Cara's clothing, they found a speck of blood on her white boot. Now, while DNA testing wasn't great back then, they were able to type the blood and found that it was AB, which is the rarest type of blood type in the United States, and was also Craig Pyre's blood type. So even though they didn't have good DNA testing at the time, it was about as damning as evidence of that nature could be. Lastly, the skid marks found at the murder scene perfectly matched the distance between the wheels of a police cruiser. So there's a lot of evidence here, circumstantial, anecdotal, and forensic, that all pointed to Craig Pyre. And 23 days after the murder, he was arrested and charged. Craig Pyre went to trial in February of 1988. And during the trial, witnesses were called forward who had said they'd seen Cara that night and had also seen a police officer following her. Apparently, Cara had stopped to get gas just about a mile or so from where she was killed, and the attendant there said they saw her getting gas and also saw a CHP officer flip a bitch and start following her as she left the station. Police, from that, surmised that Pyre had seen Cara at the station, turned around to follow her, and planned to do what he always did, which was pull her over, harass her, and likely eventually let her go. They said at some point, I guess prosecution said this, at some point after pulling her over to his favorite deserted off-ramp, Cara likely got scared, as many women before her had, obviously. But unlike the other women, she fought back. And as a result, Pyre attacked her, likely knocking her unconscious with his flashlight before getting rope from his car and strangling her to death. The scratches on his face were from her fighting back, either before or while he was strangling her. Police said he then tied her to the hood of his car so that her hair and other DNA would not get inside the car, and drove her the short distance to the bridge where he threw her body over, then went on with his night as if nothing happened. So, pretty fucked up. Now, as I noted, he went to trial just 2 years after the murder. The prosecution called a ton of witnesses. Most of them were pretty helpful to the case, though a few had their time wrong, like the timing of things wrong, or would I think it was 8:30, maybe it was 9:15. And they kind of said as such when cross-examined by the defense. This was particularly important because the defense mostly relied on the timeline to prove that Pyre wasn't actually the killer. They thought that if they could prove he was elsewhere during doing cop stuff when she died, they can convince the jury that he didn't do it. Forensic science at the time, the scientists didn't really give a good time of death for whatever reason. So they had to use her liver temperature to determine when she died. And unfortunately, that's very much not an exact science. So it showed she could have died as early as 1 p.m. that afternoon, which gave a really wide time frame for her death and made it really hard to prove that it was him, that he was there, because it's if it could have happened any time within 12 hours, it could have been anyone. Obviously, there were ways to show this wasn't true, like timestamps on the phone call to her parents from her boyfriend's house. But, nobody could prove any of this. Even if Wayne called her parents could be saying, oh, yeah, it was her, but it really wasn't. You know what I'm saying? There were some inconsistencies, and it was difficult to really, really prove it. Also, like I said, when the gas station attendant changed the time, he saw her from around 8:30 to 9:15. It made the case look really shaky. Also, there were multiple charges Pyre could be found guilty of, ranging from first degree murder to I don't know, there was second degree, there was something else that was another option. I feel like the options were a little bit different back then, so I don't really recognize all of the charges. But in any case, there were multiple things he could be found guilty of, but prosecutors were going for first degree murder. They argued that even though he killed Cara in the heat of the moment, it was still first degree in nature because of what he was doing that put them in the situation in the first place. Essentially, the prosecution was saying, don't start none, won't be none, which is fair, I think. Unfortunately, the trial came off as disorganized, and despite there being forensic evidence, jurors really ultimately didn't understand the weight of that as far as it being proof, because it's not how it is now where everybody knows about DNA. And the witness testimony being wishy-washy really threw a wrench into things. In the end, the jury deadlocked 7-5 in favor of conviction for first-degree murder, and the judge declared a mistrial. Craig Pyre was free on bail before his second trial, which took place in June 1988. So not a long time, but the fact that he was free is kind of crazy. He had definitely been fired. He was no longer a highway patrol officer. I don't even know that he had a job. Maybe he took on some part-time work, but he was free during this time. And probably murdered somebody. It's kind of crazy that they just like set his bail and were like, have a nice day. So whatever. Anyway, the trial goes back in June 1988, and this time the DA appointed a younger prosecutor who brought in new witnesses and really drove home the science part of the case. Really focused on the DNA, really focused on, well, maybe not DNA, but the forensic evidence, the fiber evidence, the blood evidence, like kind of what they had there, because that really, really is like irrefutable. Like you can't say that that's not what it is, you know, and there's too much transfer between their clothing types for that to be ignored. Craig Pyre refused to testify in either of his trials and maintained his innocence throughout. So he was like, I'm innocent, but I'm not going to testify. Now, this trial wasn't without its own little bit of drama. Halfway through the trial, a juror was dismissed because he had been... So his coworker called the courts and was like, hey, just so you know, we were watching the first trial, and when Craig Pyre got off, he told me he agreed with that because he thought that he didn't do it. He was getting a bad rap because people don't like cops, et cetera, et cetera. So when this was found out, they interviewed the juror. At first, they weren't going to dismiss him. And obviously the defense didn't want him dismissed. But in the end, they dismissed him and replaced him about halfway through the trial. So there's always these little bits of drama in this case. And like, it's just crazy to me, like reading about it, researching it, how it seems so clear that he's guilty, but there's all of this back and forth and all of these different opinions, which always gives me pause because it's like, maybe we don't know, you know, after the fact, it can be presented however, but in that moment, it's very obvious that it wasn't clear what had happened. However, finally, in late June 1988, Craig Pyre was found guilty of first-degree murder. To this day, he proclaims his innocence and has actually been denied bail 2 or 3 times now because of his refusal to take responsibility for the murder. Now, where I just said, oh, maybe it wasn't obvious one way or the other, here's where, to me, this case is like open and shut. He very tellingly refused to submit his DNA to clear his name back in 2004 when the prosecutor's office, who was working with some sort of innocence project, offered to do that for him. So what does that tell you? So he's like still saying he's innocent, but he's got an opportunity to prove it and he's not taking it. So I'm going to just call him not only a murderer, but also a big fat liar. Now, we could end the story here, but again, I have an opportunity to talk about something really amazing that came out of all of this terribleness. And that amazing thing is the endless work done by Sam Knott, Cara's father, after her death. And I don't know that I want to say that it's like good, because I believe the reason Sam did everything he did was sort of to find a way to cope and to keep Cara alive in a way. And I know that Cara's death tortured and haunted him for the rest of his life. But regardless, he made sure to turn his pain into something good for other families. So after Cara's death, and I mean like the week of her death, Sam started his crusade to get laws changed, multiple laws which he thought were wrong and contributed to her death. So the first thing he did is find the captain of the police unit that he and his family called when Cara was missing and complained about their handling of things. He said that not only did they refuse to take a report, they said dismissive and hurtful things to him at like, if I had $1 for every time someone called in a missing person, I'd be rich. So really dismissive, really shitty, and ultimately very unprofessional things for anyone to say, and definitely a public servant, quote unquote. Like, this is not the type of thing people should be saying. He also said that 48 hours is far too long to wait to look into a missing person, even if they're over the age of 18. At first, the captain agreed, I'll talk to my staff, make sure they handle things differently. But eventually, this department, along with many others, as we probably know, shortened the time for reports to 24 hours after a person goes missing, which many people still believe is too long, but it's a lot better than 48. Sam also went to Caltrans and demanded they close the off-ramp where Cara was killed, saying it had no purpose except to hide rapists, murderers, and drug users, which is what that off-ramp was basically full of. Within a few weeks, it was closed. On February 5th, 1987, Sam picked up his local newspaper to see the full details of Cara's autopsy splashed across the pages. I cannot even imagine what that's like. He was enraged, and fair to be, rightly so, and wrote a letter to chairman of the county board of supervisors, a guy named Bill, I think, or Brian. Anyway, the policy surrounding the release of this information was promptly changed because his family wasn't even notified this was going to happen. So they changed the policies, thank God, all based on Sam. And he didn't stop there. After the mistrial, he was so upset that he invited 7 jurors to his home, presumably the ones who voted guilty, and got information from them regarding what went wrong with the case. He then contacted the DA, and remember how I said they used like a new prosecutor? What I didn't mention is that Sam was directly responsible for that. He demanded that they have somebody else prosecute the second time. He was angry that they bungled the case. He wanted a fresh start, and even got the DA's office to agree to open sort of like an information pipeline between them and the Knott family. And the Knott family gave them all of the information they got from the previous jurors to help the prosecution have a more rock solid case the second time around. And as we know, that worked. He also spearheaded the nation's first federal grant for a university forensics lab specializing in DNA analysis. He worked with the Washington bureaucracy until he found who he needed, the person responsible for the grants, and he told the man, quote, "I need this technology for the blood evidence against the monster that murdered my daughter. Let me bring my family to Washington to plead my case." After speaking with this person, he ultimately did not have to go to Washington because the grant for the Sexual Assault Center was approved October 1st, 1987. That is how influential and how much he got done. Sam was not going to take no for an answer. He tried to get a tracking system in place for police officers. Ultimately, this didn't really happen until a lot later. I don't even know that it's official now, but we are all tracked all the time at this point. So like they can pretty much do it. But that was like a really big thing for him because he's like, if there was tracking of this officer, we could have immediately proved that he was there. There would have been no question. It wouldn't have been a penciled in logbook that we're using as proof of his, location, which is a completely fair point. The other thing that he did that was of a more personal nature was he had the area where Cara was murdered dedicated to her memory, and he and his family turned it into a memorial garden. Sam tended this garden weekly, sometimes multiple times per week, and including November 30th, 2000. We know he was there that day because very unfortunately, he was found in his car slumped over his steering wheel. He had died of a heart attack just feet from where Cara had died 14 years earlier. Many people say that Sam died of a broken heart. It's really sad and tragic. It's a terrible ending to this overall terrible story, but I did want to call it out because this man dedicated every breath he took to his daughter after her death, and his work is really inspirational and long-lasting. Like, he made a permanent change in the world based on, what happened to his daughter. His wife, his widow, Joyce, continued his legacy and also makes sure to attend every parole hearing for Craig Pyer. Although it's painful, she and her family, they read their impact statements in the hopes that it's going to keep him in jail. And so far it's worked. Joyce, I believe at this point, is well into her 80s. I can't really find her, but there's no obituary either. So I think she's still alive. Hopefully will be for his next parole hearing, which is in 2027 when he will be 77 years old. If he doesn't die before then, I do not feel confident he will be released because he's still never admitted to the murder, which he clearly committed. So, hopefully he stays in prison until the day he dies, fooling absolutely nobody about his guilt and wasting away as he deserves. So that is the slightly shorter, but definitely very interesting and sad case of the murder of Cara Knott and the trial of Craig Pyer. I did want to also note he was the first officer ever convicted of a murder while on duty, which is crazy if you know anything about the police brutality, murders, things of that nature. The fact that this took place in 1986 and was the first one is crazy. It's also crazy that he was convicted because it's pretty hard to get a cop convicted. But I think in a case like this, especially she's like a young white woman from a good family with money, it's going to be viewed in a different way than a lot of other cases that may come up where a cop murders an innocent person. Also, this wasn't like an altercation in the line of duty. This was just straight up like sexual harassment gone wrong. So pretty interesting. In any case, thanks everybody for listening. Once again, I know this is a little bit of a shorter episode, but this case has always interested me, so I wanted to cover it because I found it compelling and strange and notable for a number of reasons. So I hope you guys all enjoyed. Please like, rate, review, share with all your friends and family. Let everybody know. It's very sad Twisted Listers doesn't exist anymore, but we have True Crime California. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, everybody stay safe.